If you're wondering how to identify and or date vintage clothing, then this video is for you. I'm going to be sharing 15 of my best tips when it comes to both identifying and dating vintage items. Real quick, I want to welcome you to the channel and introduce myself. My name is LeeMeier. I'm a stay-at-home mom of 4, and I've made well over $100,000 flipping used clothes and other items on sites like eBay, Poshmark, and Mercari. And now I'm on a mission to help at least 1,000 resellers be able to hit that $100,000 mark for themselves. To help you out, I've got a ton of free goodies. You're gonna find them down here in the description below this video. This is where you're gonna find things like my best brands list, the list of 150 brands that has led me to the $100,000 mark and beyond. You're also going to find a link down there to be able to sign up for my free $100,000 reseller challenge. In that free challenge, I show you exactly how to reach $100,000 for yourself this year without putting in more time, without working harder. I show you how to get there actually in very part-time hours. And in that free challenge, you're also going to discover the very best things to be selling right now in today's market. All right, so one of the big pieces of reaching beyond that $100,000 net profit mark has been vintage clothes. And in this video, I want to break down for you 15 of my best tips when it comes to both identifying vintage items as well as being able to date them. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so as we're getting started, I just want to talk about how many items are selling when it comes to vintage clothing. And so I do have this pulled up on eBay here. This is just eBay. There's so many other platforms where vintage is selling, including Depop, Etsy, Poshmark, Mercari, pretty much everywhere. There's a huge market for this. And I do have a $50 minimum price point put in here over here for items on eBay. And it's still coming back with over 250,000 items that have been sold. And that's just within the last few months. So another thing I want to touch on really quick is the age of vintage items, because that is a common question that I get. And it's typically 20 years old. Some people say 25. For most people, I think reselling, 20 years old is kind of the cutoff for vintage items. Some people kind of actually do even push that a little bit, the limit of that. So we're going to go ahead and jump on into this first tip here to help you be able to identify vintage clothing items. And that first tip I've got for you is the feel of the tag, and especially what I call papery tags. And so I have an example for you, and this is on a Gunny Sacks dress. So you've got the tag here, and then you've got this kind of papery addition to that where it has the size. You can also see that the writing on there looks almost stamped, but you can see just how textured that is. And it does have a very kind of papery, crinkly feeling to this. So I do have to show you the item real quick. That's what it is. And that one sold for $200. Now, this is another example of a tag that doesn't have that papery. This is a very modern kind of standard. These are very smooth, and I wish I could have you feel this, but you can kind of imagine it almost has this satin feel. For that item. That one is a universal thread that actually did sell for $150 just because it has patchwork on it. It's a overall is what that is. And so then I want to also talk about tagless items, because right around 2002 is when tagless items started becoming really popular. And what I mean by this, so this is another universal thread item. What I mean by tagless is where that information, the brand, the size, sometimes even the material is printed right onto the fabric itself. That started happening right around 2002. Now, because vintage is 20 years old, that means that some of those newer vintage items may have this tagless look to them. And as we, get further, 5-10 years down the road, there's going to be more and more vintage items that do have, this tagless kind of look, the tagless tag to them. All right, next tip is USA made. Now, this video is up to date, and a lot of videos are dated, and they're telling you that only USA made items are vintage. If they're not made in the USA, they're not vintage. That is not true, because as I'm filming this video, 20 years ago, looking back 20 years ago, that was after the switch when a lot of items started being made in other countries. So that's no longer, a hold fast and true. Yes, if it's made in the USA, it is more likely to be vintage. Of course, there's the flip side of that there are current brands, current labels that are currently being made, like now, in the USA. So it's not always just because it says made in the USA, it's vintage. You do need to use some of the other tips that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video. So this is an example of a tag that does say made in the USA. This is from a brand that is called Morningstar, and they make these collared sweatshirts. This one has some flowers, a little squirrel sitting there on the fence. That one sold for $21 for that. But I want to show you another example of an item that's actually made in China. This is an Abercrombie and Fitch skirt. So you can see there on the tag that it says made in China. That's just a mini skirt. And this one is a Y2K item, which is vintage. And that's why this one sold for $50. This is another example of a newer item. This is from a brand called Jolt. This is also a made in China item. There's what that looks like with some super chunky buttons on that. That was really a big trend. Early 2000s is when that kind of look was trending. That one sold for $50 for what was essentially kind of a lower end brand. The next tip I've got for you is to look for the city or the state identified on the tag for where the item was made. So example here for you, it says made in Hawaii, and then it also has down here on the tag, it also says Honolulu. So this is a Hawaiian dress. That one sold for $56. Got another example where the state is called out on this tag of California. So Barbara, I think is what that is. This is another dress. That one sold for $68. Got another item here, dress from Honolulu. That one sold for $168. And then here's one example of where the city is called out. So it does say Seattle Quilt Manufacturing and then Seattle, Washington. And this is a quilted jacket. That one sold for $65. So anytime you see the city like that or a state mentioned, there is a good chance that that is a vintage item. Four is to look for woven tags. And so this is an example for you where it was pretty zoomed in on the tag, so you can kind of get a little bit of a feel what I mean when I say woven. So this is a sweater that has Mickey on it. That one sold for $56. And then this is the dress you saw just a little bit ago, and I wanted to show you the flip side of the tag. So you can see that kind of weave there on the front of the tag. And then there is what the back looks like. So it's more of that black showing through than the lighter color. And then this is another example where you can see really well there on the font of this item, or on the brand name of this item, that that weave pattern there. And this is just a sweater with crowns on it, chess theme on it. That one sold for $50. Number 5 is to look at the font or the design of that label. We've already talked about the city and the state, and if it has that woven look, if there's a papery tag, but oftentimes just the design or the fonts that are used, especially from the 80s, you're going to see a lot more blocky font, a lot more kind of blocky design to tags. This is a fringe leather jacket. That one sold for $70. Another example of a tag design here, we can definitely tell by looking at this tag that it is vintage. There's a big blocky no with the exclamation there on the back of that tag. Sorry, it's sideways. And here's what this item looks like on the exterior of it. That one sold for $42. Another example of a vintage tag there for you that has a little bit, blockier font to this. This has a goose couple on that sweater. That one sold for $60. Another fringe jacket here. This one's so cute, and had to show this tag because that's another really good example of just really kind of blocky letters for that tag. The next tip number 6, is to look for care symbols on tags. This is one that's going to be hit or miss, so you're going to have to use your best judgment to these care symbols. So I'll show you exactly what I mean by care symbols here in a second. But care symbols were starting to be used right around 1963 on garments. And these are just the icons. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying care symbols. So a logo or a symbol, whatever that is, icon, whatever it is that you want to call it. These were starting to be used on tags right around that 1963 time frame. And so some items you can use the information to better kind of hone in on when that item was made. And so it's not always going to be an easy one to use because there's brands that are made today, items that are made today that don't make use of those care symbols. So, it's not a hard and fast rule. And I did have to pull up this dress. This is from right around the 1950s, does not have the care labels on it. But you can also kind of identify by the style as well, which we'll be talking about here. But that one sold for $60 again from the 1950s. Here's another example of an item where you're seeing those care symbols, those icons here on the tag. And so you can say for sure, just based off of that, it's after 1963. It's also a Scooby-Doo sweatshirt. So that would give you a good idea of probably, what decade that's from. That's a girl's sweatshirt, by the way, that sold for $50. Tip number 7 is to look for union tags. In the USA, there are so many different union tags. I have a few of them listed out here for you. ACTWU, that's an Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union. There's Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, ACWA, American Federation of Hosiery Workers, International Ladies Garment Workers Union. That's one that you're going to come across pretty often, ILGWU. There's a Textile Workers Union of America, United Food and Commercial Workers, and then Unite. And there's been several different mergers along the way between these different unions. And a lot of times even the tags have changed looks. And so let me go ahead and show you what I mean by that. So this is an example of an ILGWU, the Ladies Garment Workers Union tag right here. You can see that that is all blue. And it also has some letters under here where it says AFL and then CIO. So those can be really important when it comes to dating items. This is actually a 2-piece set, wool set. That one sold for $125, by the way. That's another example of an ILGWU item. And on this tag, you can see that this ILGWU tag, that is different than the previous one that we looked at that was only blue. So this one has, both red and blue on that tag. There's what that item looks like. That one sold for $65. And then I'll talk a little bit about actually dating some of those ILGWU tags here in a second. But this is one here of UFCW, the Food and Commercial Workers Union. And you'll see this one on a lot of Carhartt items. So that's on the back of the Carhartt tag. There are those care symbols, so you can buy that. You know that it's after 1963 that this item was made. So there's that tag, and then the union tag is on the back side of this jacket. And that item sold for $299, by the way. Now, when it comes to dating those ILGWU tags that we just mentioned a bit ago, SammyDVintage.com has a really good walkthrough of the years that certain tags were used. So I mentioned that those letters AFL-CIO, that was used on that tag. So that could be a way to be able to identify. So they do have the breakdown here. I'm going to link to this resource in the description below this video. And then they also have a few pictures to be able to go along with this. You can actually see how that tag evolved over the years. All right, real quick, before we get on to that next tip, I do want to quickly mention my ultimate reselling starter kit. I'm going to link to it over here, but this has everything you need to get up and running and bringing in your first sales as a reseller. So again, I will link to that resource over here. Tip number 8 is to look for half sizes. I'm going to show you what I mean by this, but half sizes were something that are identified here. It says half sizes in 1958. That was kind of a standard size. It's on some different dress patterns, and you're going to see that on tags as well. And so this is an example here of a dress where it says size 20 and a half. Now, there's a few different explanations for what this exactly means. Some of it could be more for sizes, but it was also used to indicate that it was more for a petite size, a little bit shorter size. So again, you're seeing there that papery tag and that stamped look on those as well. So again, another good way to be able to identify that this is a vintage item. That's what that dress looks like. And that one sold for $69. I've got another example here where this is a dress where it says it's a size 16 and a half. So you're seeing that half size there. It's always shown as a fraction. And this is a paper tag there that's sewn into that dress. This one is also new with tags. And so I do want to point these out because you will find items that are new with tags, even if they're vintage, even if they're decades old. So this is actually a punch tag. So you can see how it's punched out there. You can see that size again, 16 and a half there on the size. So that can be a really good way just by looking at that tag that you can know that that is a vintage item. Let me go ahead and show you what that looks like real quick. There's the item there. One sold for $70. The next tip is to look for metal zippers. Now I have got a couple examples of this. This is a dress where there's a metal zipper that's sewn into the side of the item, and that's a place that was really popular. Of course, current dresses are sometimes made that way as well, but this is a dress here that is from the 1930s, 1940s-ish era. That one sold for $185, but it was really common around those decades, the 30s and 40s, when there were a lot of metal zippers being put into dresses. So this is another example. This is a dress that's where the zipper is on the back of the dress, and that is a metal zipper there. And here's what that looks like. That one sold for $175. Number 10 is lack of tags. So let me explain what I mean by this. In 1960, there was something called the Textile Fabric Products Identification Act, and that required that fabric content, labels, and care instructions be put into clothing. There was again a further movement to require garment labels in 1971. So you can kind of date items based off of those numbers. Now, there are lots of items prior to the 1960 date that do have brand labels and that do have content labels and care instructions, but it can be a way to identify maybe items that don't. And this is most common in older items, especially antique clothing, meaning it's 100 years old and older. This is absolutely fascinating topic, huge market out there for antique clothing, super, super, super profitable niche. I do have a video I'm going to link to up here where I go through antique clothing in depth. And in that video, I show you items to be on the lookout for, as well as to help you further identify antique items. So I've got a blouse here for you. This is what this blouse looks like. It's kind of a tweed material. There it is on a mannequin. But I'm going to go ahead and show you the inside of this. And there is absolutely no tags on this. You're not seeing, in the side seam, any sort of tags. There's not care instructions. There's not material tags. There's not a brand label to know who made it, if a company made it, if a person made it. There's no identification on this. And this is super common, especially in antique clothing, as well as items, prior to when those requirements were. So that one sold for $90, and that one did have 22 bids on it. Tip number 11 is to look for lot numbers on items. So lot numbers started being used when items were starting to be manufactured in bulk, and when manufacturing was moved to large factories, they needed a way to be able to identify which lot an item came out of. Lot numbers aren't used so much anymore. They are used every once in a while, but they were really popular in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So this is an example of a Lord and Taylor item. And this one you can see where on the tag it has the size 14, and then lot. and this is the lot number there. So they're not always handwritten, but when you see that handwritten, that can also give you a good way to be able to date items. And so it does have a lot number on that handwritten of 152. So there is that item there. That one sold for $132. The next tip is to look for zip codes. And this can be a way to identify if an item is made prior to 1963 or after 1963, because 1963 was when zip codes were first introduced in the US. Prior to that, addresses, they would have the number, the road name, the city and state, but there was no zip code. It just did not exist. So if you see zip codes on items, that means that that item's made after 1963. If you're seeing an address without a zip code, then that is made before 1963. So this is an example here of a brand that's called J. Thorpe, and you're seeing the road here. It says 57th Street West, New York, and no zip code on that. This is what that item looks like, and that one actually sold for $650. This is a tip that probably you're going to use a little bit less because not a lot of brands do include their address on their item. I want to take a second to invite you to check out the Empowered Reseller membership program. This is where I'm personally able to answer questions. It's where I'm able to even do things like store reviews, account reviews, listing reviews for my VIP members. It's where I'm doing live trainings each and every month, and it comes with a huge course master vault, as well as access to me, access to our exclusive VIP community where I'm doing live trainings each and every month. And you'll find the link in the description below this video to be able to go and check it out for yourself. And I hope to be able to welcome you into our community soon. Number 13 is to look for countries that no longer exist. So if you're seeing a country on a tag like made in, and then a country that is no longer in existence, you know that that item was made before that country dissolved or was turned over to somebody else. So a few examples for you would be Hong Kong, Newfoundland before it went to Canada, Yugoslavia, French, Indochina, or a few different variations of that. So here's an example for you of an item where it says made in Hong Kong, 100% polyester there. There is that item that went for $90, by the way. And then this is a Adidas jacket. This one is actually made in Yugoslavia. So you're seeing here on the tag, made in Yugoslavia. So you can go ahead and date that item just based off of when that country was in existence and before it dissolved. The next tip, number 14, is to look for Woolmark stamps. Now I'll show you what I mean by a Woolmark stamp, but this was really a way to be able to market wool items, especially as synthetic fibers were starting to be used more and more. And so Woolmark symbols were launched in 1964. If you have a wool item prior to that, it will not have a Woolmark label because that was not in existence. So I'm going to show you what I mean by those Woolmark stamps. So this one over on the far left, that was when Woolmark logo was launched. And this signified items were made with 100% wool. In 1971, that logo was redesigned, and then the standard was dropped from 100% wool down to between 50 and 99.9% new wool. And then there was another logo right around the turn of the millennium, 1999, and that is the logo that you're seeing over on the right. And this is for items that have 30% to basically 49.9% new wool in them. So that can be a way to be able to date items that are made of wool. Now, tip number 15, which I'm actually not even quite there because I did add a bonus tip, so stay tuned for that. But tip number 15 are vintage fabrics to look for that will be labeled on tags. And as a marketing effort, brands that came up with these different synthetic fibers actually branded them and put names to these different fibers. And so I've got a list here for you of 10 different synthetic fibers. There are more than that, but these are 10 that you will come across: acrylon, Celanese. I'm not even sure if I'm saying some of these correctly. Dacron, Orlon, Codel, Talon, Caprylon, Xantrel, Kia, and Vicron. So you'll see these labeled on tags. So I've got an example here for you, and this is a coat from Sears. By the way, I do have a video that I'm going to link to up here where I go through some of these department stores, these big box brands like this. And these are super interesting for how much these are selling for. But you'll see here on this tag where it has the material, it actually says 100%. And then you're seeing Acrylon, acrylic fiber. So that is just that branded acrylic, that name for that. And let me show you what this looks like real quick. It's a jacket. That one sold for $55 for that Sears branded jacket. I've got another example here for you. And this is from a brand called Selkirk. And you're seeing here on the tag that it does list out Dacron polyester versus current tags today will just say polyester. So this is 80% Dacron polyester, and that gives you an idea that what era this is from and that it is a vintage item. So that's what that one looks like. That one sold for $40. Tip number 16, a bonus tip for you, is to look at the style of the item. We've covered so much already, but there is so much that you can identify just from looking at the style of the item, the shape of the item, the color of the item, the look of the item. So I've got just a handful of examples for you here, but I really could spend tons and tons of time here. I actually probably will do a video in the future about looking at the different decades. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel down below so that you don't miss out when future videos like that drop. So a few examples for you here. Let's say 1920s, flapper dresses were popular. 1950s, fit and flower dresses were popular. 1970s, bell bottoms. 1980s, geometric designs and color blocking. So a lot of times you can look at those different design features, the shape of the item, the silhouette, and be able to identify what decade it came from. And I know that we have covered a ton here, so I want to just quickly recap. And I also want to mention that I have completely updated my vintage clothing guide to be able to cover in depth everything that we've talked about in this video, plus so much more. So I'm going to link to that over here. Inside of that vintage guide, you get so many tips of not just being able to identify vintage clothing, but I also give you 150 different vintage brands and items to be on the lookout for, as well as I cover things like pricing vintage items and where to sell, where to find vintage items. It's all covered inside of that guide. So to quickly recap, number one, look for the tag feel or feel the tag. Number two, is the item made in the USA? Number three, does it have a city or state on the tag? Number four, is it a woven tag? Number five, look at the font, look at the design of the tag. Number six, look for care symbols. Number seven, look if there are union tags. Number eight, are there half sizes? Number nine, are there metal zippers? 10, is there lack tags, no tags? Number 11, is there a lot number? Number 12, is there a zip code or lack of zip code? Number 13, is it made in a country that no longer exists? Number 14, does it have a Woolmark logo on it? Number 15, what is the fabric or material of the item? And is it a branded synthetic fiber? Number 16, the bonus tip is, of course, to look for those styles. All right, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. And if there's another way that I missed in this video that you know of when it comes to dating vintage clothing or identifying vintage items, go ahead and drop it in the comments and share with the community. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for today's video. And if you're looking for specific vintage items to sell in your reselling business, I'm going to link up here to a video where I go over specific items to be on the lookout for. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I will catch you in the next video soon.